Okay, welcome to the Building Doctor Show. I'm your host, Jens Johansson. Glad to see you here to learn more about your buildings. Today, we're going to talk about flood insurance, big flood insurance, as opposed to water damage and rainwater or wind-driven rain, that kind of water intrusion. So we're entering October and we're expecting some of the first big rains after dry summers. There might be some flooding from clogged drainage, clogged storm sewers, even stormwater backups. So we're helping you figure out what the difference between flood insurance is and just normal rain or water damage or leaky uh, hot water heaters. So if you're joining and listening to us on the podcast or YouTube, thanks for listening. But be sure to visit our website at j2consultants.com to register for the Building Doctor Show and attend live via Zoom. This allows you to enter questions that you have, and it doesn't just have to be about flood insurance. And so if you have any of your board member and you have any curious questions about what do I do in this, enter it into the chat enter it into the Q&A, and we'll get that answer for you at the end of the show. And you also, there'll also be a little QR code if you just have a quick question about your building and you don't want to ask it live on the webs. You can sign up for a free one-on-one call with one of our building doctors. So our producer, Carolyn, will be monitoring the chat. She'll be putting some handouts and flyers and things like that in there. And then I will go through the Q&A panel at the end of the show. And after that, we'll have our raffle giveaways. So stick around for that. And remember to like and subscribe and enter your questions into the chat. All those things help our show reach more people. They help the community that we serve. You have a question that can probably benefit a whole bunch of people, and so feel free to do that. And then disclaimer: remember, we're not giving engineering, financial, legal advice. This is for educational content only. So let's get into it. And there's our cool soundtrack music again. How fun is that? Okay, we will advance slides. And there, it turns itself off. Thanks, Zoom. Thanks, Zoom, for cooperating. Okay, so today's agenda. Our timing couldn't be better. We put these agendas together. This one was put together 2-3 weeks ago. And just this weekend, we had a big earthquake in Russia, 8.7 on the Richter scale or magnitude scale. And that put out tsunami alerts for all of the Pacific. And, so we had this Sunday. And so we're talking about this stuff and it's relevant. We're located in the Pacific Northwest. We also serve, Mountain West. And so we'll talk about kind of flood risks there. We're going to talk about the types or different types of flood coverage. I've heard there's kind of, the National Flood Program. What about private? What about private flood insurance? Which is better? What do we need? We'll talk about the claims process. That'll benefit you from either flood insurance or regular water damage insurance, and prevention and risk strategies. We've talked a lot about that in previous shows, and then some key takeaways. So flood insurance is totally different. It's a separate policy. It's like earthquake insurance. You got to buy flood insurance, and that's different than my unit flooded because my refrigerator ice maker line burst and my hardwood floors are all wet. That's I need water extraction and I need fans and DUs, and it was something kind of inside my unit. It wasn't this big thing. So the differences are, we'll talk a little bit about what water damage is versus flood. So here we're using a slide straight from ServPro's website. So you notice the ground is flooded, the parking lot is flooded, the loading bays are almost getting water into them. Here's a car driving up the ramp to get out of the water. So this whole area this is a flood. So how is that different than, my toilet overflowed or my pipe burst in my unit, which caused water damage? Is much different than my unit was flooded. So we'll talk about that. So this is, again, ServPro's website here. Thank you for the pictures, ServPro. Here they're extracting water. So there's water all over their floor and hardwoods, and they're sucking up water. And so this could happen in a flood, but this typically happens in, hey, my water tank burst and got all over my unit. So we want to think um, flood insurance coverage means a rising water event, like a tsunami, a river overflow, a dam burst, uh, and it's related to you living in a flood zone or a flood plain or maybe on the coast, things like that. So again, here's the levee broke in New Orleans, right? So this is a big flood barrier and it broke and New Orleans is underwater. Here is a site. It could be a site drain. It could also be a utility pipe. It's the cap over that, and water is clearly coming up from that. So the sewer city backed up, and maybe it flooded my basement. Um, another way to talk about floods is feeding groundwater. It's pouring down rain. We see some of that, but hey, maybe the creek overflowed or just there was so much rain. We talk about rain in inches per hour. And the code gives us, depending on where we live, 4 inches per hour is a pretty good storm. But we have some of these others, it's just we call it gully washer. So that's just all the water flowing down the gully. And so when it rains in drier areas or Utah or Texas, they get X amount of rain per year, but it happens in 2 days, and so they get inches of rain, and so that's site water, that's storm surge, that's kind of runoff. So that's flood insurance. So kind of some things to think about. Flooding is bigger than you or your property. Think of it like Mother Nature. Something big broke or backed up. Water loss or water damage is something inside your unit broke, or maybe your resident above you, something broke and water intrusion is damaging your unit. Other thing with coastal properties is, we have this nice property on the beach and we have a small beach retaining wall. And most of the time, the tide, it goes up and down and it's still behind the retaining wall. But every year, the highest tide of the year is called the king tide. And so that king tide is way up top of that, right at that top of the, breakwater. What if there's a storm on a king tide day? So two things align, wind and storm and, just waves, and the tide is already the highest point. Then that floods, so then we talk about sandbags and first floor units getting kind of invaded with what? They're invaded with salt water or invaded with, this river type stuff. So it's not rainwater, right? So kind of the perfect storm. All right. So here we get into causes, and I'll break down why we're talking about this. So cause, the high winds ripped off my roof shingles, which allowed rain intrusion, which flooded or water damaged my house. In this case, the storm or wind damage was the cause, and most policies will cover this. These are your typical property insurance policies. Is rain, wind-driven rain, storm event, clearly indicated to high winds that damaged something, water got in. Now, the old drippy water the old drippy leaky water heater finally gave out, flooded my unit. Why is that not going to be covered? So it's old, drippy, leaky. Okay. So most insurance policies have something about continuous seepage, continuous leaking and seepage over time, seepage over 14 days. And so I've got this old water here. It's rusty. There's a little water on the floor, but all of a sudden tomorrow it just gives way. And so that stuff usually isn't covered. So this is why we have something old and decrepit that needs to be replaced. The insurance company says you should have replaced it. or with the plumbing repair, the old uh, cast iron pipes finally gave way and rusted water, or the new PEX plastic pipes had some problem or defect with them and gave way, whoosh, big leak. Those types of things, the old drippy things are not covered. The sudden and accidental leaks, it was instant, it was sudden. Those things are covered, usually under your policy. So this other box here, a fire sprinkler pipe, those sprinklers up in the ceiling, broke on the 17th floor and caused water damage, flooding of all the units below. So this was because this was the fire sprinkler's fault and not flood damage, not tsunami damage. This was, you blame the fire sprinkler sub or some type of issue there. Usually covered under most policies, but again, we kind of get into this: who's responsible? Was the fire sprinkler sub just working on it and he's supposed to let his glue dry for an hour, but he was in a hurry, let it dry for half an hour, turn the pressure back on, and the glue failed and the thing blew all over. Okay, the fourth one, that rooftop swimming pool that everybody loves, cracked and flooded the unit below. So I leave some dots after that as, okay, was it a sudden and accidental thing? Was it an earthquake? That we've seen these pictures lately of these swimming pools and rocking and waving around. If the earthquake caused the swimming pool to flood, that would be the earthquake insurance policy I needed. Or was it sudden and accidental? Okay, then my master policy would cover it. Or was it kind of an old leaky swimming pool that had been dripping over time? Now we get into that 14-day seepage. So this is, and I'm kind of being vague because most typically covered or maybe covered, leaving some dots after it. It's important to have a good insurance policy and understand what's covered, what isn't, and kind of take it through these steps. And that's when you're talking to your insurance broker about that. Of what happens if the tide comes in? Well, you live on a floodplain, and so you need flood insurance in addition to your master policy. What happens if this breaks? Well, that's covered by your master policy. So you can run through these scenarios with your broker. Let's see. Yep, talked about that. Okay, so here's some causes, definitions, and tricky scenarios. Back to when we're trying to determine if things are covered or not. So poorly installed windows, leaking, causing water damage to the exterior walls, windows. A lot of times that's covered. Deck or roof membrane leaks. Here's some deck with some siding pulled off, and we can see the water damage there. This is again rain or runoff causing water damage to my ceiling, deck, or roof. Okay, so let's talk about this. Over on the left or on the right, these ugly looking windows, and they're even deteriorated, and they even have some trim popping off. So this is obvious. This is obvious water damage, probably requires maintenance, or definitely requires maintenance, if not replacement. And then we get into over here, we've actually had to peel some things off to find this damage. So we get into what's called, a couple of legal terms, latent and patent. So latent means hidden, patent means totally exposed. And one way I remember that easily is patent is spelled the exact same way as patent. What does patent mean? Here's my manufacturing process. I'm going to publish it to the world. You can't copy it. I have patent protection, right? So it's very, very clear. So in this photo, back to these old windows, it's very clear that this is pretty damaged. So this is patent. Latent, this deck is hidden water damage. I had to peel siding off. My deck coating looked great, but for whatever reason, water was getting in through bad flashings or whatnot. And it wasn't until I peeled off the fascia and the deck that I saw this. And so latent, hidden, patent, not. So in previous episodes, we were talking about insurance companies coming out and wanting to inspect your building before they issue a new policy or before they renew your policy. They're going to walk around and look for this. They're going to say, I'm not putting an insurance policy on that. That is patent damage. I don't want to be liable for wind-driven rain claims, things like that. And so they're saying, we're not renewing you until you fix this. So that's kind of where we're getting into water damage technicalities. And then we'll really move into flood. So, all right. So now we kind of get into, well, here's a little bit more, some couple more situations that we've seen. So, flood insurance is different. So it's a standalone policy. So don't say my unit flooded to the adjuster. It's a keyword that pops up in their head and they go, oh, we have flood denial, we have flood exclusion. So I'm going to be lazy and just deny your claim. You said it was a flood. Now, did water from an interior source or whatever, did something just happen sudden accidental? I actually have water damage and I need water extraction and fans and dehues come out and inspect that type of stuff. And so here's where that played out. So we have a employee that lives in North Carolina in their hurricanes last year. So big storm, big hurricane, North Carolina mountains. So the rain from the hurricane caused mudslides, which slid down the hill, dammed up the river. Then the river overflows because it has a mudslide dam in it. The river overflows and floods some houses. So we've got houses alongside the river. Maybe they're in a floodplain. But what about the houses uphill? Clearly not in the floodplain. So we've got, well, we're denying your claim because it was a flood. And so we have to kind of backtrack. Well, if it wasn't for the hurricane, which is a typically covered thing under my master policy, I wouldn't have this landslide and I wouldn't have the flooding if the landslide didn't flood the river. And so I think rain caused all the sequence of events, and you're denying my flood claim because flood is not covered. But then even houses up the hill were being denied. Well, this is part of the flood. Well, I'm not even in the floodplain by the river, and the mudslide damaged my house or knocked trees down. Well, it was part of a big flood event. And so you can see where these words get tied up and misconstrued, and things tend to not happen well. So I just want to drive home the point. I think we plowed that field enough, but be very clear. Was it a flood or was it a pipe burst? And I just need water extraction. My unit may have flooded in either scenario, but I need some cleanup. So, okay. So the myth, my homeowner's condo insurance covers flood damage. Nope. Two different policies. Think of flood insurance like earthquake insurance. It's a separate policy. So standard property insurance specifically excludes flood damage and the related coverage. So obviously they can be expensive, but there are other contributing factors. So like the hurricane, like the mudslide, like the, or the high winds blew my shingles off, then the water came in. So what is the sequence of events here? But if you say, hey, my unit's flooded, well, they might believe you and they might deny based on you don't have flood coverage. So understand those differences. Okay, so again, a table comparing the two. Standard property insurance covers burst pipes in the walls, water heater explosions, appliance failures, roof leaks, ice dams, wind-driven rain. Standard property policies do not cover, most water that starts outside the building and comes in, except rain and wind-driven rain. Sewer backups. And sometimes we require separate coverage there because it's a utility, but flood insurance covers that usually. Surface water runoff. And again, this is just a sheeting of water that you see running across the surface. Groundwater seepage that's bubbling up, or it's just a high water table and it's flooding your basement. It's really not on the surface, but I know it's right there. And then this storm surge or this river flooding thing we've talked about. So tsunami, storm surge, or river overflowing its banks. Again, think big outside. Remember that picture we saw of the entire parking lot? The whole neighborhood is flooded. That is where flood insurance is needed. And so, master policy flood coverage, unit owner, individual flood coverage. So, when we have this flood insurance, especially in a condo, you have your master policy, and then do you have an additional interior policy like your HO6 that's part of your standard stuff that insures your contents? So again, we need your contents are insured from fire, tree strike, and things like that under your normal policy. Yet a flood, would they pay for your couch? Would they pay for that stuff? So master policy, you got to make sure about elevators. That's a big deal, because elevator with a hydraulic or a pit system, so as you can imagine, the salt water from the ocean comes in, sits in that pit, all the salt rusts the hydraulics and destroys everything. And elevators are expensive. And so all your stuff that's usually in your parking garage or kind of your below grade situation, your mechanical, your boilers, your electrical equipment, your all these, rooms or utility rooms are kind of tucked down in the basement for some reason. These things might have a problem. Now, on your master policy, you can also get some temporary housing for all residents. You can kind of, because it's kind of business operation, right? I'm in the business of having a condo which has units. The master policy can have a housing allowance, or the individual policy can do this. Individual policies obviously are personal property, interior improvements, additional living expenses, ALE. ALE. That means hotels, food, a trip to Walmart to get some clothes because everything was destroyed. So those are all ALE items. And then some of them have, if anything's not covered by the master, we'll cover it. Or if it is covered by them, so they start blaming policies or crossing policies again, right? So this is another one of these. I have flood insurance, but it doesn't cover that, or it does cover that, or you're supposed to get this in addition to us getting that. Another thing to pay attention to is business interruption claims. If you run a rental property, I don't live in the condo, but I rent it out. Do you have business loss interruption, or something that pays for my tenant is displaced? I got to do all these repairs. So that's part of a normal fire policy. You'll see that in a normal fire property insurance policy, that they will pay your rent and do those things, and that way you can keep your investment moving. And there we go. Now, so 30-day waiting period rule. You can't buy the day before the storm, and you can't buy the day of the storm. There's usually a waiting period unless you just bought it, or policy updates or renewals or things like that. So plan ahead for these seasonal risks. So when you buy flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, that's the think FEMA or NFIP, coverage doesn't start right away. They have this 30-day waiting period. Similarly, you can't buy wildfire insurance when the hillside's burning, that kind of thing. And so if there's a storm forecast, you can't buy it right before the storm. So, but again, let's see, loan requirements and things like that. Map changes. So we have these things called floodplains. You can Google your property and say, am I in a floodplain or am I in a flood zone? And so FEMA updates these things consistently. Some days they're changing the lines for whatever reasons, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So if they've changed the lines, you got to buy now, or they've reduced that, you can get rid of your policy, whatever. So 30-day waiting period. Think about that. In the Pacific Northwest, hey, we've got November through March. We have heavy rainfalls. We've got snow melt. In the coastal conditions, we've got the king tide we talked about, or storm surge. sunny day flooding in low-lying coastal communities. And then urban flooding, aging storm drain systems. Okay. So I don't know if you've been through other countries in high rain, their storm system isn't set up for it. And why are the streets flooding? This is weird. And so a lot of that is sewage. Flash flooding. So just kind of things to think about there. Mountain West. Wildfire. So we have wildfires are a big deal on the West Coast right now, and they're burning at the end of summer. We see flooding after a fire for like 3 to 5 years. The burned areas don't have any vegetation that drink the water, right? And B, the soil gets baked. In these real hot ones, the soil can just get baked like a clay. And so the water just runs right off it. So we've got more risk for mudslides and things like that. You've got more risk of snow melt, ice dams, ice jams. I'm going to jam with that ice dam. So the ice dams are when icicle, you see all these beautiful icicles and say, isn't that great? Well, that's because your heat in your unit is coming out, melting the snow. It's converting to an ice dam, and snow and ice and water don't flow off the roof. So it backs up under your shingles. And again, flash flooding and things like that. All right. So let's see. National Flood Insurance Program. So this is the government program grade. One size fits all. They spread the money around. And the big risk there is, remember last year when FEMA ran out of money? And so I thought I had FEMA coverage. I thought I had National Flood Insurance Program. So it's all right. And so here's the coverage limits. So up to $250,000 for condo associations. All right. If that tidal wave came in, what would it damage? Contents coverage up to 100,000 per building. So I've got a lot of first floor units. I've got to split up this 100,000. So here's what I'm saying. It's kind of one size fits all, and here's some limits. They don't have any coverage for temporary living expenses. Replacement cost versus actual cash value limitations, the replacement cost versus actual cost. And then some things it doesn't cover. So swimming pools, fences, landscaping, those are all damaged by a flood, right? But they're kind of designed to keep, let you have shelter, keep you in your home. We don't care about your swimming pool because again, we have that limited pool, and we need to cover as many people's houses. I don't care about your pool and your landscaping, your fences, because I want to take care of people's houses. Any kind of property outside the building, financial losses due to building, business interruption, additional living expenses. So you can see where private insurance maybe is a better option for you. So advantages: higher coverage limits, replacement cost value, additional living expenses, broader coverage, faster claims processing. I haven't had to file a claim with the National Flood Insurance Program, but I imagine it's like talking to the IRS. We'll get around to you eventually. So considerations: usually more expensive. Coverage varies significantly between companies, and here's where them understanding condos versus single family homes, and it may not be available, but it's usually more available, and that's why it's private. So the federal program is going to be working off of floodplains in the zones, and then you're just going to say you're in this, you have to buy that, or basically your bank says that for your mortgage. But there might be some ones that are not in a floodplain, but I am on a different piece of ground that doesn't drain well, or I'm worried about this, or I'm next to a stream, so I want to buy some additional flood coverage. So just letting you know, there's the government program and there's private programs. Private programs cover more, usually a little bit more expensive, but can be specific or tailored to what you have. Special considerations for condos, determine proper coverage amounts for shared facilities. So who pays for the clubhouse? Who pays for the common areas? Remember, these common areas are outside your unit. So the national program is just your unit. It's not the common area. We want to make sure we got that pickleball court going. But you're also coordinating between the master policy and then the individual unit coverages. So just kind of get somebody to break all that down for you. And then, hey, special assessments when the insurance falls short. So remember, the national insurance program had 250,000. Well, if you're 500,000 per unit, you're going to be 250,000 per unit short. So you'll be doing special assessments or loans or whatever. And then loss assessment coverage for unit owners. And so that's more contents, that's all that, figuring it out. Right. Understanding the flood zone maps. And here's where you can Google it. So the FEMA flood map. So they have these zones: AE, high flood risk; VE, we can kind of go down these things. A, coastal. You can read that. So look up your property's flood zone, and then understand. They give some terminology about 500-year flood. That doesn't mean it happens every 500 years. That just means it's this magnitude, or 100-year flood, or 500 years. So it'll happen, and when it does, it'll be a problem. So they'll have these gradients, and that's why they've defined out these zones. And of course, if you're in the highest risk, you're going to pay the most. And then beyond the official map, so climate change affects these patterns, local drainage issues not reflected in the FEMA maps. Who knows how often they've been updated. Historical flooding in your area, and this is kind of an interesting one. Historical flooding in your area and local knowledge. And so I coined it lobbyists versus farmers. I grew up in a small town, farming town. There was a big river going through it, and the farmland next to the rivers, about every 10 years, it would flood, and you'd see these fields flooded. And that's sad for the farmer because his pumpkins are flooded or whatever. But about 10 years ago, we see this housing development going on in these fields. And it was like, wait a minute, they're building a bunch of houses in a place that floods. How can they do that? So then I go to the flood zone map, and oh, guess what? The flood zone map's changed. This is no longer a flood zone. I'm like, interesting. I wonder if some lobbyists got together and bent these rules so now we can build here. But here's where local knowledge comes in, and not 100, not 5 years, not 500, but every 7 to 10 years, that field floods. And so I'm worried about those houses there, and I hope they've done something. Maybe they have changed the drainage issues. Maybe they have put in a dam or a dike. Who knows? And so again, pay attention to local knowledge, and that's somebody that's been here a long time. Is this normally a flood thing? Or when you're buying a new condo and kind of checking it out, hey, is this in flood zone areas? And then of course Google it, FEMA flood map. You can Google your address. Okay, so how to determine this? They've got calculators, but replacement cost of structure is not market cost, and this is any kind of insurance policy. So if my building were to burn down under my standard property policy that I have right now, these units, or this house, sells for $1 million. I could probably build it for less than that, right? It's a pile of 2x4s and sheets of drywall and some things like that. So I can rebuild it for $700K. Granted, I can't buy it unless I pay $1 million. So you want replacement cost, not market value. And so you can talk to contractors. You can get a rule of thumb for 250, $300 a square foot, and that's how we determine those things. Include code upgrade requirements, especially if your property's old. So that house built in 1960s that burns down or floods or earthquakes away, I want to rebuild my house. Well, now we're rebuilding for new building codes, and we got to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. So those are called code upgrades or code requirements. So make sure you have coverage for code upgrades. And then consider those shared facilities, pools, clubhouses, things like that need to be rebuilt as well in this flood event. Personal property, individual unit owners, obviously that's a complete inventory. So what do I have? And I need insurance for it. If I've got prize collections, my baseball cards, or a lot of jewelry, a lot of this, a lot of that. You figure that out. Then we talk common area contents and equipment. Hey, our rooftop deck has 50 chaise loungers, and rooftop deck won't flood. Let me talk about our patio outside has a hot tub and a bunch of chaise loungers and barbecues. So are those things included? Because the individual property policy doesn't include that. The master policy is just talking about the building unless you add on these things. And so technology and communication systems for your stuff, satellite dishes, things like that. All right, claims process and what to expect. And this applies to anything, any kind of claim you're making, but talking about flood insurance here. So first 24 to 48 hours, safety first, understand electrical hazards, structural integrity. Is the building safe to be in? Is there anything, that could cause further damage? Did the power pole get knocked over and it's arcing and zapping? Okay, then document everything. Photos, videos, before cleanup, during cleanup, after cleanup, during construction, just document everything. Make sure you have photos of everything. Even now, before the event, before the flood, walk around your house with on your phone on video, and you just, yep, here we go. I'm just walking through the kitchen. And then you can slow that down later and say stainless steel GE dishwasher. And you can kind of make your list if something gets wiped out. And then, of course, contact your insurance carrier immediately. Get in line, get a claim number, ask for an adjuster to come out, visit the laws, assess the laws, and then begin water removal and drying process quickly. We've got about 72 hours before mold and things start becoming a problem. So that's back to these water extraction services, lots of them out there. And then make sure you save all your receipts for emergency expenses. And here's my hotel, here's my meal, remember these ALE, additional living expenses. And so save those receipts, take a picture of them. So then communication strategy for boards, hey, maybe designate a flood response coordinator. That here's how we're working on this. Here's how these claims are being handled. We have filed a claim with our flood insurance adjuster or insurance company, and here's this update, kind of giving people some update, or here's the adjuster's number and email. Your insurance policy can reach out to them. So we got this resident communication system, coordinating with local emergency management, documenting all decisions and expenses. So again, this is claims process in general. Just do this stuff, but especially in a flood event. Okay, so the best practices in a big flood event. Remember, we have our master policy, our individual policy that covers normal stuff. Then we have a flood policy. Maybe just the master has a flood insurance thing. Maybe some individuals have not bought an individual flood insurance policy. Maybe some have. So now we have 4 insurance policies times how many units you have. So this is where we need a clerk of the works, so to speak. So hire a consultant, a public adjuster. Believe it or not, there are insurance experts that can really help you coordinate these things. Maybe your management company has a insurance loss, designated person that knows how to communicate back and forth. So these become complex and large, and so full-time job for somebody for 3 months, right? So then get independent damage assessments from bidders, keep all the records of the communications, understand your policy requirements completely. Obviously, you don't have to read them too much after you buy them, but when it gets down to nitty-gritty time, We really need to understand what our policies cover. Promptly notify and coordinate with your insurance company to assist them with their adjustment of damages. Their insurance adjuster is adjusting the claim with an adjustment of damages. That's where the title comes from. So stay on top of them to get your project finished. They're busy like everybody else. And if a big flood has come through, they've got all your neighbors they're dealing with. FEMA or National Flood Insurance Programs are usually slow to pay, right? It's a government system and they only have so much and first come, first serve, right? So I'm just saying, get this done, get it done, get it happen and make it a priority. Dedicate somebody to do this. And then watch out for the kitchen table settlements. And so what do I mean by that? So in any kind of big disaster, the adjusters that come in, they actually, in the industry, they call them storm troopers. And so they're storm adjusters. They fly them in. They're busy. And what kitchen tabletop settlement is, I see your loss, and it's, hey, would you take 50,000 bucks? Oh wow, that sounds like a lot of money. Sure, I'll take that. Here, let's sit down at the kitchen table, sign this release, and I'll write you a check because they don't want to process all the losses and update all the stuff. And if they can get you to settle for an agreed upon amount, they will. So their duty is to pay the claims on what you agree with. And so oftentimes I've heard many stories of, hey, I got this big check waved in my face. I thought I could do it. And then I've got actual bids because what do the contractors do? The contractors swarm in with guys in the back of their pickup bed because it's lots of people want some work done and I can raise my rates and I can get to work. So I don't know if they call them stormtroopers too or not, but you get the idea. People are taking advantage of the system. So now the bids are higher and this check, I agreed to get a check, maybe doesn't cover it. But the one positive of that, I have my check. All my neighbors are waiting on the claims to be adjusted, the paperwork to be filed, the people to finish their estimates and all this stuff. I can start rebuilding right now. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying just review them carefully. All right. Prevention, building level flood prevention. So we've got structural improvements and we've got maintenance to prevent this stuff. So the structural improvements are proper grading and drainage around your buildings. Go outside, walk around your building tonight. If the site goes like this and your building's in the bottom of it, that's a nice bowl, right? If there's anything we can do to change the landscaping to slope the water away from my building, and that's rainfall and that's any kind of flood coming down the street, I don't want to flow uphill. I can flow downhill into your neighbor's property. So grading and drainage. And then drainage would be all buildings have foundation or footing drains outside them. Are those in good shape? Or are they filled with leaves and pine needles and things like that? That gets into your site drains. Some sites have, there's a grate out in the middle of the lawn. Where does that go? Is it full of junk? Has it been cleaned out in the past 20 years? Will water flow into there and be whisked away to the right place? And so figuring these things out, making sure your sump pumps and backup power systems are working. A lot of times the power goes out if it's a big flood or any kind of other disaster. So make sure your backup generators are working. Have you gone through this? So this is kind of part of your maintenance checklist to check. Flood barriers and water resistant materials. So exterior foundation walls, you may have below grade units, they're called. So 3 feet is below grade and the windows are kind of above. That's called a half a unit or a first floor unit or below grade unit. Maybe you're built into a hillside, so part of the unit is below grade. Well, if there's any below grade portion of the unit, and we've got a high water table or we've got kind of some surface water and it's finding its way through the cracks in the foundation, excuse me, make sure your waterproofing and your drainage or drain material is working correctly. And then kind of check on your utilities and mechanical systems. Not that you're going to relocate your boiler room, but is there any way to, if it, or maybe it's elevated and it would get wiped out in a flood surge and fall over. So kind of look for those things. Are my utilities going to work? Is my foundation going to work? Is the site drainage working for me or against me? Um, and then are my sump pumps and drain system working? So maintenance, again, storm drain cleaning, roof and gutter maintenance, foundation crack monitoring, repair, landscape management for proper water flow. So a lot of buildings have what's called negative slope towards the building. And so anything we can do you can regrade your lawn, you can regrade your landscaping and keep that water away. So a little bit of community planning. What can you do? You can develop an emergency response plan, having kind of these evacuation procedures, emergency contact, flood barrier, coordination with local emergency services, resident education, going through a little bit of individual flood preparedness, understanding the insurance responsibilities is the big one, of just either requiring them to have flood insurance, making sure that maybe the master policy covers that, or we're going to go ahead and cover it as a master policy and raise the dues to cover that. So at least we have something. Emergency supply recommendations, things like that. Financial planning, again, reserves. How's your reserves doing? We've had several episodes on getting your reserves up to a healthy amount. If you don't have anything, there's going to be some special assessments for some of these improvements. Insurance deductible planning, is that a line item on your budget or is that in your reserves? Sometimes these deductibles are kind of big. And then maybe there's some federal grant opportunities that you can work on. So here's some planning that you can do as a board and as a committee, or just as a resident. All right, so key takeaways. Water intrusion or water damage coming from your building or the rain is usually covered under your master policy. Flood insurance is totally separate. So your standard insurance policy does not cover flood damage or flood events. So regional risks are real. Pacific Northwest, Mountain West have specific flood challenges. Gully washers rain all the time. They're different for how you in what part of the country you live in. That 30-day rule. Remember, this is something you plan for. You don't wait for the weather forecast. And then prevention and insurance. So both are necessary for complete protection, and just really that making sure that you've got all those different levels and all those different policies working together, not overlapping, but working together for you, because you'll have denial from this, you'll have coverage from that, but I don't cover that, but that's covered under this, and I can get coverage back around through these policies, and you're kind of connecting the dots and tying everything together. All right, your 30-day action plan. Google your flood zone and assess your current coverage. Are you in a flood zone? Is there a river, lakes not so much, but is there a river nearby? Is there a dam? Is there a water? What do you call those? Transferring water, not viaducts, but aqueduct. Could that break? Could that flood things? Understand that. And then consult with an expert. Get flood insurance quotes from both the national plan and private insurers, and understand the difference. Quotes are free, right? And so we can see the difference. We can understand it and make a decision. And then review and improve that emergency response planning. Here's kind of a whole new thing. Most properties do not have flood insurance that we see. And then you can start implementing these flood prevention things as we go into the rainy season. So this is the action plan. All right, you need some advice on your buildings, and this is the open advice line, or specifically insurance we're talking about. So we can help with your building. It's a free 15-minute call. If you like to type, go to learn.j2consultants.com/consultant on call. Otherwise, click the QR code and that'll take you to my calendar to set up a time. And this is where we talk about anything, or you watch the Building Doctor show and you enter your question in the Q&A. So let's jump into Q&A. And we had 3 questions sent to us between shows. So we put this out and said, hey, put it on your calendar. And so we started getting a bunch of questions about flood insurance. So First one, if we do get hit with flood damage, who actually handles the claim? The HOA board or individual unit owners? And what happens if our master policy doesn't cover everything? Are we as homeowners stuck with special assessments on top of our own flood claims? So who's gonna handle the claim? The adjuster from your flood policy is going to determine your flood insurance coverage amount, but you're gonna have other policies involved. And so is this covered under this? Is it covered under that? They've denied me, they haven't, they might pay, they might not. And so consider a consultant or insurance claims expert that can be kind of a clerk of the works of this. Sometimes those costs are reimbursed because they, they understand that there is a lot of flying loopholes here. And sometimes your management company has a person that's dedicated to this type of stuff too. So for any damage that's not covered by insurance policies, you have to pay. And so is that payment in the form of your reserves? So another good reason, remember we say 50 to 70% reserve, balance. Got some money, that's what it's for, this weird event. Or if you don't have reserves, you're going to have an assessment. And so you'll have another assessment to deal with. But the hope is that you have proper flood insurance policy coverage to pay for that. And it's done. Just like a fire or any kind of toilet overflow that you have in your normal policy. But additional assessments are a risk. Okay, next question. We're located near a creek that's been dry for the past few years due to drought conditions. Some board members think this means we're at a lower risk now, but I've heard that drought can actually make flooding worse when rains do come. Is that true? And how should that factor into our decisions? So again, it depends on the soil. So a creek bed usually has sand and rocks in the bottom of it. And maybe it's a little drier summer and it's dried up, or a couple of summers in a row and it's dried up. It'll likely percolate again, or meaning the water will soak through the stream bed and continue to act like a stream bed. If it's dry, hard, and been baked in the sun for 3 years, now we start kind of taking on this porcelain look. So go down a stream bed and scratch around with your shoe or stick and just see. So this remember we talked about it in the forest fires where we see actual baked hard dirt because of the heat. Maybe the clay stream bed could do that as well. And so in that case, water is going to flow right through it instead of draining down into the aquifer or whatever that's underneath the stream. So ultimately these are risk or business decisions that you have to make. Climate change, things are getting drier, or weather patterns are changing, let's call it that. And so what used to be a wet flowing creek is now kind of dried up and not flowing as much. So maybe your risk has gone down. You already have a creek bed, so any surface runout water will go in there and hopefully follow the creek bed until that overflows. So creek is different than river. Creek, maybe I'm not so worried about. River, a little more worried about. I don't think there's flood zone maps around every creek. So I would, make that decision, but it depends on the soil there. And let's see, last pre-sent-in question. Let's see if we got some other Q&As. I see one in there. Good. Okay. So we are looking at a major building renovation project next year. New siding, windows, maybe some foundation work. Should we wait to get flood insurance until after the improvements are done, or does it matter? And will these improvements help lower our flood insurance costs? The only thing I would say there is foundation work. So, but typically improvements are factored into insurance premiums in a good light. But let's also pay attention to the flooding, and does flooding normally affect new windows? No, flooding would affect that foundation wall though. And so runoff, tidal surge, things like that. So If you're doing some foundation work, maybe you're digging down and replacing that foundation drain or adding some more site drainage, waterproof your foundation. So if any water is getting onto it, it stays out. Fix those cracks, do that stuff. Generally, again, back to the insurance companies investigating properties. Does it look rotten or does it look new? If it looks new, hey, maybe my risk of a claim goes down. And so I would probably say do it afterwards. But again, flood can come at any time. So depending on the time of your, um, but so I guess I would say, is a flood going to come in the summer? Probably not so much. So if my building repairs are going to occur over this winter, building will look nice and new by the time I get flood insurance in the summer. But I'm headed into the winter. So do I want to fix that foundation now or have flood insurance coverage for those cracks or, conditions that could cause that? So that's how I'd think about that. Um, but flood insurance probably isn't going to care about new windows and siding because that isn't the thing that's stopping the flood or the city from flooding, so to speak. All right. So then we go over to questions from this show. Okay. If we experience flood damage and file a claim, will our premiums skyrocket or could we even lose our coverage altogether? Oh, interesting. So if we experience flood damage, so we have flood damage and we file a claim, will our premiums go up or could we lose coverage? So this would be flood insurance policy. And your premiums aren't going to go up till next year if they do. Your premium going up, usually, we had a previous show about this and the insurance premiums and why they go up or not. They're a function, they're kind of a bigger function of the business unit itself and the area. So the 2 or 3 insurers that were in Florida last year with all the hurricanes, yeah, their insurance rates went up over every possible insurance policy they had, and they paid out a lot of money, and so, and then maybe they're not offering insurance in Florida anymore. So those are the reasons why they would lose coverage of we're moving out of Florida. We're not offering insurance coverage here. So typically premiums don't skyrocket after a claim, and typically you don't get canceled after a claim or not renewed. But it's up to the insurance company. But the takeaway: I buy flood insurance and I pay flood insurance premiums to use my policy, and that's what everybody's agreed to. They've agreed for this much a month, I will pay out that potential thing, and so I would definitely use it if I had it, and use it if I had damage because that's what it's there for. So if they change, there could be several other reasons why they would change or raise costs. So good question. All right. Any other questions? I don't see any more. All right. Good questions. Okay. And then we're done with those. All right. Stay tuned here for the lucky draw here. And we've got some pumpkin spice cookies. Of course, it's 'tis the season. Got a leather binder for you to take notes and make your action plans about flood insurance. We got a battery backup, so just in case the power goes out and that flood insurance is, you need to power your phone to file those claims. So let's see. Let's say 5. Number 5 gets this giveaway. So Carolyn sees how you sign in. You sign in. It's basically as you log into the webinar, and she will reach out to you and mail this out. So thank you for playing. And then let's see. Did you know we have lots of additional training here? So you can either, if you like typing, learn.j2consultants.com/resources, or use the QR code. You'll see a whole bunch of training and seminar stuff and YouTube videos and all these things all in one place, which is pretty nice. Here's another way to find everything that we do on one page. Use the QR code again, as all the content. Sign up for all the stuff. And then be sure to stream this wherever you go. New episodes twice a month on all your favorite platforms. And again, do us a big favor, rate us 5 stars wherever you hear us. That's our fuel to produce more for you. Leave something in the chat and thumbs up and subscribe and hit all those bells. Appreciate you. Thanks for learning about flood insurance, and stay safe out there. So, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.